It's the world's newest nation, but will South Sudan soon be at war with a country it broke away from? Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Phil Rees. Well, Sudan and newly independent South Sudan may be sliding back towards war. That's what the United States, and the European Union are warning. South Sudan gained its independence last summer, and the two countries had a 22-year civil war which left 2 million dead and another 4 million displaced. The former nation of Sudan divided largely according to differences in faith and culture. In the south, most people follow Christian and animist beliefs, and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement was formed 30 years ago to fight for independence. The north, meanwhile, is mainly Muslim, and much of the country's power and wealth has been concentrated around the capital, Khartoum. The civil war ended in 2005. The Khartoum government and the SPLM signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, as it was called, which laid the ground for the independence of South Sudan. But serious problems remained unresolved, amongst them the distribution of oil reserves and in particular the status of the fertile and oil-rich regions of including Abyei, which lies in the middle of the dividing line. Well, the ground clashes that erupted this week are the first between the two sides since South Sudan became independent. But many think the repeated failure to demarcate the border properly has left the two countries holding a ticking time bomb. Haria El-Haddad has the latest.
South Sudan says the Sudanese Air Force bombed oil fields in a cross-border raid on Tuesday, one day after a rare direct confrontation between the two countries. Clashes broke out on Monday in several places along the poorly marked border, in some of the worst fighting between the two armies since South Sudan became independent in July, under a 2005 peace agreement. The latest violence prompted Sudan's President Omar Hassan al-Bashir to suspend a trip to Juba to meet his southern counterpart Salva Kiir. The two countries have been at loggerheads since the south became independent, taking away 3/4 of the oil production, a lifeline for both economies. South Sudan accused Khartoum of sending warplanes to bomb the main oil fields in Unity State.
Bentiu has been bombed this morning, and the bomb has been falling between Bentiu and Rup Corner. So we are being bombed since morning.
Both sides have blamed each other for having started the fighting on Monday, and events in the border area are hard to verify as much of the territory is disputed and not accessible. Each country has accused the other of supporting rebels on either side of the border, but direct confrontations are usually rare. A spokesman for Sudan's armed forces, Colonel El-Sawami Khalid Saad, said ground forces had attacked southern artillery positions in response to an earlier attack by the south, and clarified that the whole area is under the control of his forces.
هي في يد القوات المسلحة بنسبة 100%. وأي ادعاء غير ذلك يحتاج للأدلة والشواهد. نؤكد تماما أننا كقوات مسلحة وجيش دفاع شعبي وشرطة احتياطي مركزي وقوات أمن ووجود اجتماعي فاعل لأهلنا من قبائل المسيرية وغيرهم من القبائل التي تعيش في تلك المنطقة، كلهم الآن يعيشون في هجليج كمدينة وكحقول البترول والعمل فيها الحمد لله مستقر.
Both countries have been unable to agree how much the landlocked south should pay to export its crude through Sudan, prompting it to shut down its production after Khartoum started taking some oil as an unpaid transit fee. Khartoum and Juba earlier this month had reached 2 agreements on free movements of citizens in each other's territory. But with the two sides once again fighting on the disputed border, there's a sense that peace is not yet in the pipeline.
Thank you, Haria, for that report. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined today in the studio by Olivier Warham, the Sudan Director of Waging Peace. We also have from the European Sudanese Public Affairs Council, Dr. David Hoyle. Thank you both very much for joining us. Olivier Warham, if I could turn to you, what happened this week?
Well, the week kicked off with North Sudan bombing oil fields in South Sudan beneath the border, crossing international airspace. But what I think we really need to focus on is not the north-south issue that is becoming the main talking point. With the fighting that has been happening along the border is actually in southern states of North Sudan. the majority of the fighting has been within the north. Therefore, this is a north-north issue, not just a north-south issue.
But this week it was a north-south issue, though, you're saying. You're saying that fighter planes went across the border illegally.
They did, absolutely, and the South has repelled them and has moved up, I believe, into the Heglig oil area.
And is this over the fact, I mean, what is exactly, let's try and pin it down, because, you know, it's very complicated, this, for viewers, north-south, you know, so what exactly happened, in your view, that triggered this? And why did they fly? I mean, they didn't just decide to go there, did they? Why did the North enter South Sudanese territory?
Well, there are many unresolved issues from the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and oil is one of them. And of course, it is incredibly important because it plays such a huge economic part for both countries. As a result of the South gaining its independence last year, Bashir, the president of Sudan, has been left facing a population whose economy is spiralling out of control. He has an army who feels very angry about the loss of such a huge part of their country. So he is looking for ways to try to overcome those problems with his people, and attacking along these border areas is how he's trying to.
You're suggesting he's deliberately provoking.
Of course,
the Sudanese President Bashir. David Hall, what's your interpretation? Would you agree with that?
Well, it's very hard to recognise almost anything of what I've just heard. The simple fact is that the government of Sudan has jumped through every single hoop which the Western states have actually put in front of it. It's actually voluntarily conceded the concession of independence to 1/3 of its landmass. It's actually voluntarily conceded the surrender of up to 2/3 of its oil wealth, actually the South, in order to secure.
That was part of a separation that the public of the South overwhelmingly wanted.
Yeah, but voluntarily in a peace agreement, which everyone actually agreed to, and at some expense domestically to President Bashir and his government, because he also has a very conservative right wing in his own country. It's a bit like actually handing over Northern Ireland to willy-nilly. There would be a huge amount of ramifications. The simple fact is that was done in order to actually enhance the peace process. And so to actually hear accounts, and somewhat jaundiced accounts, that they have nothing better in mind than to actually continue with conflict and war. It's just it jars with reality. The other simple fact is that there are, of course, difficulties because parts of the border were left unascertained. We have the issue of Abyei, whether it's in the north or in the south. This area. That's
the oil-rich state, just to remind viewers, an oil-rich state, whose destiny hasn't been agreed yet.
It's not a state; it's a region. But what actually began.
What happened this week then? Why did Bashir send his planes into another country?
Sure. What began much of this issue, quite simply, was after the independence, after the split, there were still armed members of the SPLM and their various groupings of factions within
the former
what's
rebel
now,
army.
Yeah, North Sudan, and these actually continued to engage in activity. They were armed. There was a process of actually trying to disarm them, and that's when you had, in effect, two new armed insurrections beginning in the north. It may well be in the north, but these are SPLM affiliates. From the south.
Are these in the states whose destiny itself has not been, the three states whose future has not been agreed?
No, they've all been agreed. South Kordofan and Blue Nile State are within what's left of Sudan. And from there, things have escalated, up to this present day. I don't know exactly what these aircraft may or may not have been doing in the north of southern Sudan, as it were. They may well have been in hot pursuit of a number of these other groups who have been causing trouble. The actions of the government of South Sudan was actually very self-serving, because you have a failed state already in South Sudan. You have 8 or 9 different armed factions fighting against the government of South Sudan already, at the north and in the south of what's now South Sudan. And this is a very old formula. You try to externalise your own problems by invading another country.
Well, a lot of complicated things there. Olivia Warham, I mean, the point is apparently that there are forces from South Sudan in the north, the former rebels. I mean, that's, David Hall's point there, and that these fighter planes were quite possibly chasing them away. In fact, making a return to South Sudan?
Yes, I mean, there are many things that I could pick up on. I mean, the first is that Dr. Hoyle mentioned the reality. The reality is that citizens are being forced from their homes by bombs to live in caves. The reality is that Bashir has said that if they wouldn't accept the governor who was forced upon them, who is an ICC indicted criminal, then they would be forced from their homes. They are prevented from planting their crops. They are now entering a humanitarian disaster.
Now, yeah? A state in the north.
This is a state in the north.
Which is it, by the way? So
South Kordofan.
And South Kordofan.
And Blue Nile State.
Yeah.
So that's where the majority of the fighting has been happening. So to talk about this being a conflict between two armies is completely misrepresenting it.
But David Hole's point would be that the people fighting in the north, he would suggest, are actually southern agents provocateurs, for example.
Well, my point as a human rights organisation is that innocent people are being killed, and this is not the first time we're seeing it in Sudan. President Bashir is an indicted criminal. Let's not forget that. That is a fact. If we want to talk about realities, that is a fact. The second fact is that hundreds of thousands have been displaced and are being forced into starvation if they have not been bombed. That is the reality, and that is what I think we really need to be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, David Hoyle, it is now the territory then of Sudan. Surely that's the responsibility of the president to ensure that these human rights considerations and indeed the living conditions of these people are properly looked after.
Well, the difficulty, of course, is that any conflict and any civil war brings with it the fundamental abuse of human rights. I mean, any conflict has this. In Northern Ireland, we had this actually for 30 years. Unfortunately, any conflict begins with that premise, very, very sadly. And that's why it's always important to bring these wars to an end, which was the case in 2005. Africa's largest and longest-running civil war actually brought to an end. What we're seeing now is the regurgitation of much of the sort of propaganda, Western propaganda, by NGOs and various other groups that kept the first civil war alive for more than 20 years.
Well, but let's get to the point, though, that just to address Olivia Warham's point there, that this is not actually a war between North and South, but there are conflicts within the three states on the border whose was for a long time disputed. Is that fair?
Well, no, these are the destiny of what is actually within Sudan now, and those states is not in dispute. Everyone agreed. Everyone signed the 2005. What you do have,
point is that it's more of a war within these states rather than involving the South.
You have armed insurgents whose loyalty is actually to a foreign government, so operating within those two border states. And it's as simple as that. When you get those armed insurgents actually are trying to kill a democratically elected governor of South Kordofan, well, again, that actually tends to escalate things. Then you actually throw into the mix the whole issue of Abyei. You still have, and always have had over the last 30 years or so, a range of external influences who want to continue to destabilize Sudan. We have a recipe for disaster.
Do you think it's a problem that the president of Sudan is wanted, by the International Criminal Court?
Let's look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. This is a European court, European funded, European directed, aiming at black Africans. Right, the big five powers who actually direct the ICC, who actually control it, who finance it, and who direct it, are the former five big colonial powers within Africa. The African Union has actually rejected the ICC for exactly this reason. It's a bankrupt, unprincipled and discredited institution.
So do you believe that Sudan is somehow being targeted in that way, that it's not part of what George Bush used to talk about, the international community, some kind of global consensus, and because Sudan isn't part of that it's being, as it were, disadvantaged in other ways?
Well, I think that the whole issue these days of exactly what the international community is made of actually is a fascinating thing. It's no longer white middle class Europeans and North Americans. We actually have a vast hinterland. There are over 100 emergent nations in this world, and countries like Brazil and India and China and Russia are beginning to actually challenge that rather old and racist concept that it's only the West that actually is the international community. And the ICC is a prime example of that sort of intrusion, that judicial autism, which has kept wars alive in Africa to this day.
Okay, well, look, let's try and separate some of these issues, because clearly there's the whole question of the ICC there. We don't want to spend the time discussing that, though I think that there are issues to do with that in terms of, the role of the West in that. But do you think it's actually been helpful that they've indicted the president of a country that is in the middle of negotiation, the middle of, as it were, separation? And is that not a hindrance to perhaps the ability of him to operate?
I think it's completely disingenuous to compare the situation with Northern Ireland. I mean, the separation of the South was, as you mentioned, voted on by almost 100% of the population. Therefore, you're talking about a completely different scenario. You also, when we come back to the ICC, have the reason for the indictment is because of the genocide that has been happening in Darfur. Now, if somebody is responsible for a genocide, for killing 300,000 people, there is, we believe, in international justice and bringing people to account for it.
Is Darfur linked to this? By the way, just again, many viewers will know about Darfur. Well, why don't you explain in that sense what the links are?
The real issue here, and this is where the Northern Ireland comparison, as I say, is completely disingenuous, is that the minorities in Sudan have for many, many years been marginalised, and this is what has caused the problems. And this is verbalised very clearly by Bashir when he talks about cleansing, when he talks about preventing black people from eating. Many phrases that he has used to make it very clear that black Africans are not seen in the same way in his regime as the Arab population. Now, because of that marginalisation, that has caused problems not just in South Kordofan, which we're talking about now, not just in Darfur, which has had 9 years now of ongoing genocide, which has still not been resolved, but also in East Sudan. So this is really a problem about the centre taking the control, taking all the money from oil and having no respect for the minorities. Now, the international minority rights group International has put Sudan as the second worst country in the world for its respect for minority groups. That's where the real problem is. And again, coming back to the reality, I'm interested that Dr. Hoyle says that there's a bit of unfortunate collateral. Bombing your own civilians, having policies in place that says we will prevent them from eating, we will prevent them from planting their crops. That is not collateral damage. That is targeting civilians, and that is why he should be punished. That is why the International Criminal Court is holding him to account.
David Hoyle?
As I said earlier, this is exactly the sort of long-distance sort of a pressure group politics, half-world imagery that actually led.
There's some evidence of this.
Reality.
It's not reality. The only person
Who
on
do you
God's
speak
earth,
to in
the only
Sudan?
person. Well, you obviously haven't been to Sudan before very recently.
I speak to Sudanese people all the time.
When was the last time you were in Darfur?
I don't need to be in
you
Darfur.
haven't been in Darfur.
To
But if you go to
Darfur is every
single
day.
person in Darfur is black. They might say they're African. They might say that they're Arab. They're all black. So there's sort of a long-distance white middle-class analysis from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 miles away of what constitutes a black Darfurian who might be Muslim or who might come from a black tribe or might come from an Arab tribe, which is black, is at the heart of this whole issue. The only person, by the way, who actually endorsed the concept of genocide in Darfur was George Bush. The European Union said this is not genocide. The UN said this is not genocide. The UN Special Commission on Darfur said this is not genocide. So it serves a certain cause very well to actually categorize everything that's happening in Sudan as genocide and to label it in black and white terms. The only racial thing which we should always look at is that there's a self-selecting group of white middle-class activists who want to recolonize Africa in their own way. However you want to actually define it. It's the white man's burden sort of reborn. And that's the difficulty we have. We see it in the ICC. The ICC alone is responsible for the deaths of thousands of black Africans. There would be peace probably within Uganda right now, probably within parts of the Congo, if it were not for interfering autistic
and you
white
think the Western
middle-class
media
activists.
then as well, who reflect a lot of what Olivia Warham said, is wrong?
Well, it's another self-selecting group of white middle-class
Can I ask a question of Dr. Hoyle, which self-selecting group he is? Because I would like you to ask him who funds him, who he works for and what he's representing, because I represent the Darfuri people that I speak to all the time. I'm representing somebody I spoke to yesterday who was explaining to me that in Khartoum 4 years ago there used to be many, many boys on the streets, black boys. They have now all been rounded up and forcibly recruited to become soldiers in the army. These are the people that I'm giving a voice to because they are not given that voice themselves. Freedom House rates Sudan as one of the 10th most repressive regime in the world. That is the opinion that I'm representing. I would like to know which opinion he is representing.
Well, answer that question then directly.
Well,
then.
Very shortly,
organisation.
Very shortly, we'll come on to the slight extension of the.
Well, no, but the question first.
The slight extension of the all black kids being rounded up in Khartoum story, which is that they're actually being drained of their blood to use for army casualties. This is one of the oldest stories. No, it's that close to it. That's exactly the extension which we heard actually. So 20 years ago, I was hearing that sort of story in the 1980s, 1990s.
Could you please ask Dr. Hoyle to answer my question?
May I ask also, actually,
it's a fair point, though. Your organisation...
My council is funded by 2 British companies who are involved in Sudan. Who funds your organisation as a matter of interest?
Charitable organisation.
Which ones?
The Barrow Cadbury Trust, the Roddick Foundation, the Tinsley Foundation, and 3 or 4 others.
And where do they get their money from?
Philanthropic people. Can I just come back to the point?
They get the money from business.
What's the key point?
They get the money from business.
We are here to talk about the issue of Sudan, and Dr. Hoyle is showing that he is able to take us on to all sorts of other questions. We have just skated over the collateral damage. That's the real issue here. It's what is going on. You said it's a shame that people get killed.
Every conflict brings casualties. That's why peace is the single most important issue.
We should be talking about is the human rights issue of people being killed in Sudan by their own government. And that is what is really important here. And taking us on to stories about blood being taken from children or whatever it is, making my organisation being put under the spotlight, whichever way you want to do it, you are just deflecting from the main argument that you invited us here to talk about.
Let's try one thing. Let's try and answer the big question. What about the prospects of a major conflict between the 2 nation states? I mean,
I don't think there is going to be a major conflict between the 2 states. They can't afford it. Neither of them have any money at the moment. There is a lot of public opinion in Sudan that is building up against Bashir. There was recently a funeral for the Communist Party leader, Ibrahim Nugud, and there were thousands of people on the street calling for revolution and freedom. There is a growing movement there. There is a business community that is wanting to...
But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be a war, though, does it? I mean, however, that doesn't mean, in fact, it could be the reverse.
Well, they are more concerned with the issues in their own country than taking on a war with the South.
I mean, David, on the broader question now of the war or the lack of it, do you think there's a chance of it, or do you agree with, on this point,
we've heard these sort of a pre-written shopping list of issues which... my friend was actually determined to get onto the programme. The simple fact is, the sad thing is, I think we are actually sleepwalking into another major conflict in Sudan, north and or south. You have, in effect, a failed state, a gangster state, a kleptocracy in the south, who a few weeks ago said, we will actually now shut down our own oil facilities because they weren't able to actually arrange...
Coming to an end. But you are concerned, are you? I mean, do you reckon that Hillary Clinton and the European Union are right to say they are worried as seriously as they are?
There's every possibility of a very severe clash in Sudan.
Well, listen, I'm afraid we've run out of time there, all right? Thank you both for joining us for that, and big thank you to all of you at home, to our production team. Next week, we'll be back with another look behind the global headlines on the world this week. Try and join us then. Assalamu alaikum, and bye-bye to everyone.